thank you all for letting me come out. I really appreciate it. I'm trying to get the word out right now. Right now it's just me, but I'm hoping that the idea spreads. I'm going to give a very quick speech, and then I'm going to turn it over to questions and answers. I hope that you do have questions. If you do, the harder the better. Don't hold any questions back. So I'm going to give first a list of things that could happen if California follows the plan I'm proposing in the book, California's Next Century 2.0 Economic Renaissance. And then I'm going to explain how all of this wish list I'm going to give right now can happen. And that will explain what the book's about and the title of the book. And then we'll go to questions and answers. So first, the wish list. These are things that could happen as proposed in the book. Number one, half of your taxes removed. Right off the bat. Yeah, I know. Wait, it gets better. Number two, half of the bureaucracy of running a business in California removed. Three, the debt, somewhere between $8 to $25 billion, paid off. Four, 200,000 new white-collar jobs. 100,000 new blue-collar jobs. Public schools in the poorest neighborhoods, brought up to not just the best in America, but world-class standards. Plus your roads, bridges, dams, airports, seaports, levees, and government buildings brought up to first world standard. Plus increased world trade. Plus, and this is the main point I'm selling in the book, a recession-proof economy just for California for the next 100 years. So that you, your kids, your grandkids will never ever go through the economic period that we're going through right now. Plus, a qualitative jump in the quality of every elected and appointed government official like you've never seen before, and a return to local control at the city and county level like you haven't seen since the 1960s. Let me throw in a few more. World peace, increased international trade for America, America's image improved, again a recession-proof economy for California, and jobs for everyone, always, all the time. So I know, sounds radical. And again, these things are not possible right now. But with the plan that I'm proposing, they all are possible and at the same time. So first, a history lesson to explain how this can be. In the next 10 to 40 years, there are going to be new superpowers with as much money and raw influence as America. Their names are going to be Russia, China, India, Brazil, and possibly a Southeast Asian collective known as ASEAN, A-S-E-A-N. These countries have figured out that capitalism and some form of democracy is the way to go. Since they figured that out, their economies are starting to rise because they have large populations. At some point in the future, predicted by economists around the world, these countries will get to have the amount of money as America. Right now, the EU is already richer than America. We don't talk about that. So what happens when there's not just one U.S. with the influence around the world, but now 7? For the last, since World War II, America has been the dominant influence on the world because the other option was communism, represented by the USSR. Dictatorial economics, control over everyone's life, or the American option, something like free capitalism and something like democracy. Countries split into one of two camps. They followed the USSR or America. But something happened in the late 80s, early 1990s. America won the Cold War. And now we're in the period where America is the victim of its own success. Everybody has realized that the American model is the way to go. So now they're competing with America. During the Cold War, India and China and Brazil weren't sure that capitalism was the way to go. So they didn't participate as much. Now everybody's sure. Communist China isn't communist. Neither's North Korea, neither's Cuba. Everybody trades. They've all gotten this. So what happens in the future when there isn't one form of democracy and capitalism to follow, but 7? How do we know that the world is going to prefer and choose the American model and want to stay in the American orbit, when now there's other equal options? And just to point out how this could look, China is a capitalist country. They buy things, they trade, they sell. And they have some form of democracy. It's at the lower community level. But China is nothing like America. But they're another model of democracy and capitalism. So if you look at the Chinese model and the American model, and you can see how they both meet a lot of the same things but are very different, what happens in a world where now there's 5 more different types? Let's complicate this even more. These new superpowers want to have influence in their region of the world the way America has influenced the entire world. So India wants to be the main person influencing all countries in their region, like America used to do after World War II. China wants the same thing for their region, Russia, Brazil, ASEAN, etc. What these new superpowers are doing is they're going to the organizations that have spawned and kept world dialogue and peace for the last 100 years, like the UN, like the IMF, International Monetary Fund. These new superpowers are going to these organizations less. They're going to the UN less. They're going to the G20 less, the IMF less. And they're making their own international organizations and then inviting neighboring countries around their country to join their international organization. And they're specifically banning America from joining their version of the UN because they want to act like America and they want to have their version of the way the world should be set up. Shanghai Cooperation Council in China is an excellent example. Russia's doing one, India's doing one, Brazil's doing one. Has anybody ever heard of Mercosur? That's Brazil's union, yeah. Russia has something like the ETA and India has Joint Trade Authority. We've seen a situation like this before, where you have rising powers pulling out of international organizations that keep everybody at the discussion table peacefully and starting to make their own pie or section of the world. It was the period from roughly 1880 to 1910, or the period leading up to World War I and World War II. Some people consider that one long one. At that period, you had new countries who had not participated in the world economy suddenly rising and wanting a piece of the world pie for themselves. Their names were Germany, Japan, and Italy. For a while, things worked out. But at some point, Japan had conquered so much new territory, they decided they didn't want to play by the rules of the I forget, Justice League or whatever, the body before the UN. League of Nations, thank you. So at some point, Japan says, hey, we have enough properties, we have enough ownership, we're just going to leave the League of Nations and do things our way. Germany does the same thing, then Italy. And in a short order, you go from an international economy, for the first time that you've ever seen it, with multiple countries trading, to an international war like you've never seen before. Now, I'm not saying that the period that we're going into is going to result in World War III. What I'm pointing out is that you have multiple foreign policy scholars saying that the period that we're entering into in the next 20 years most closely resembles that 30-year period right before World War I. I'm not saying it, foreign policy scholars are. They're not saying it's going to happen, but they're saying that the closest thing that we've ever seen to what we're going into was that lead-up of Japan and Germany. So, how do we make sure that the world stays peaceful and that international trade continues? Because one thing's for sure, you're not going to stop the rise of these new superpowers. They figured out that capitalism is the way, they're going for it. No one and nothing is going to stop them. This is the way that the entire world and human evolution has moved. What I'm proposing is that we need a new international discussion nexus place for these new superpowers for the needs of the next century. And what I'm modeling this off of is Switzerland. If you look at every peace negotiation, business negotiation, shipping negotiation between international corporations or international countries, almost all of them were signed in a little city called Geneva, Switzerland. This goes back 100, 200 years. Switzerland in the last 2 years has issued 2 official reports saying they can no longer be the world's discussion nexus for all the countries coming together and peacefully negotiating like they had been in the last century. The world has simply changed too much for Switzerland to provide the service to the world they did in the last century, but for the needs of this next century. Basically, Switzerland is part German, French, Italian, and a group called Romansh. And so 150 years ago, when Europe owned most of the planet, Switzerland went to Germany, France, England, Italy, and said, you guys need to talk. You need to stay at the negotiation table and negotiate, not have war, and trade. And they got them to do that because they said, hey Germany, we speak German. We have German culture, but we see ourselves as Swiss. And they could go to the French, and they could go to the Italians and say the same thing. So for almost all of the countries of Europe, the one country that was the physical embodiment of all these European countries negotiating and living together peacefully was Switzerland. So it became the natural arbiter for all discussions in Europe, literally for a century and a half. Just type in Geneva, Switzerland, common negotiations on any internet search engine, it comes up. But now the Swiss said they can't do it. We need a Switzerland that has Indian, Chinese, Brazilian, Russian, American, European, and Southeast Asian peoples, he gets it, the way Switzerland did. We need all these peoples to have lived together for a very long time, have basically become the living embodiment of these peoples living together, but still have a language and cultural connection to these new superpowers. And what I argue in the book is, I've looked all around the world, California is the only place, land, area, people, whatever, that comes remotely close to having the domestic demographics for the needs of the next century the way Switzerland did in the last century. And what I'm arguing is that we can't pick up where the Swiss left off. The Swiss have said themselves they can no longer provide this role. The world is already pulling away from the world centers of discussion. So, we provide this role, we make ourselves rich, and we literally keep the world on a peaceful path. Or, we don't pursue this, and we continue to stay in a recession. We've been in a recession 5 years, by the way, documented in the book. Multiple national news commentators saying, if you are Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, there are no new ideas. No politician, no party, no one has suggested any new ideas. We're talking about cutting taxes or raising taxes. Those ideas have been out there for 30 years. We're in a recession the likes of which you see once a century, and we have no new ideas on how to deal with this? How does that make any sense? This is a new idea. It would save us. And all of your politicians and all of your parties don't have any new ideas on how to get you out of this situation. This is at least something. And it's based upon a working model from a country that Switzerland has basically never had a recession. Switzerland has the lowest unemployment rate in the world today. Switzerland has been the richest country in the world for 200 years. They've had the highest social living standards for 100 years. That's not an accident. It's because they made their economy to become the negotiation nexus. Even when times are bad, countries and businesses still have to negotiate and still have to invest money. Switzerland has a recession-proof service. But it's over, and they're not going to provide it anymore. We can provide that, and frankly, only we can provide it. If we don't do it, there isn't anyone else that has what it takes. So it literally won't happen. And you will continue to see China and India and Brazil and Russia going to UN meetings less, making more of their own orbit, pulling in other countries, and again, excluding America from all of their new trade organizations. We can make ourselves rich, we can get out of this recession, we can have everything that I promised, and we can do it in a way that helps America and literally saves the planet. I'll turn it over to questions.